the reality spectrum, right, with real reality being on one end and virtual reality being on the other, and there being a series of other types of reality in between, can you guys, in maybe a sentence or two, describe how you see those things as being different? You know, reality versus mixed reality and augmented reality and virtual reality.
What I found in sort of studying this landscape with some other people is there's been an attempt to make a defined language. And what I understand about it so far, less from my own conceptual level, but more from a stance of how we're supposed to talk about it versus how we may decide to talk about it here. Of course, we're all familiar with reality. And then let's say augmented reality comes next. And it could be the interface, something overlaid onto our reality, but it's not necessarily interacting with our reality. And then mixed reality would be more integrated into our scene, so, and not necessarily physical, but we can argue about that later if we want to. So, you know, like the Pokemon or the asteroid comes into this room and blows up, you know, a piece of glass or something. Mixed reality. And then virtual reality, of course, we're in another space, which, as we've seen from the projects, can be also related to our real space, but it's taking us out of what we really usually consider reality. So that would be, as I understand it, the traditional definitions. But I also understand that augmented reality and mixed reality get all mixed up, and people, I think, traditionally refer to everything as augmented reality.
The notion of virtual reality at the end of the day is a form of physical reality, because we are sensing that environment with our existing senses, and the level of immersion depends on how successful that technology is in terms of imitating the kind of experience that we have with the physical objects around us. So at the end of the day, I think one of the traps, at least for me as an architect, is a form of fascination with what is traditionally defined as augmented reality, as a sort of an overlay into the physical world, because I think architects usually have a very obsessive, like fetishized relationship about the way in which materiality relates to human experience. But if you consider actually how we live now, majority of our time is spent on looking at a screen, whether we like it or not, and whether we deny it or not, and there's a certain kind of escape from that experience as a sort of an alternative, but it doesn't matter how many hikes you go to. At the end of the day, you're going to be looking at a screen. And you might as well even be looking at a screen when you are on the hike, which is something that people do. So, I mean, the point that I'm trying to get at is that actually it's a good thing that the level of resolution is increasing in the way in which we experience virtual spaces, because it opens up a lot of creative possibilities in the way in which we can expand upon forms of creativity like architecture, so that it allows us to, in a way, expand our point of view about what we consider to be human experience.
Just real quick, but what I like about what Guvenc just said is that he's essentially saying that we can have mixed reality without screens, right? So it's not just the visual sense that allows for mixed reality. At the VRLA conference last month, whenever that was, there were some great panels talking about how you can have an augmented or virtual reality experience using audio, right? And how audio has to be part of it. And to carry on with the idea about you can go on a hike, but how many Fitbits are you wearing, right? And getting into self-quantification as well.
Anyway, in terms of whether or not we define them as being different things, I'm curious to see if any of you guys can talk about specifically how maybe the state of constant mixed reality works its way into your design process, and at what point does it begin to impact or affect the way that you work and the products that come out of that labor?
Yeah, well, for Nels, this is loud. For Nels, it was more of a platform. I think for you, it was more of a process using VR as a process tool. But for me, it was more of a new environment to create narrative from. So I'm not necessarily interested in designing with VR, but more so using it as a tool or a new space to design it. I think VR is probably the best opportunity that's hit the discipline of architecture, because we finally have a chance to showcase our projects or speculative ideas in full one-to-one scale. Like, for example, Guvenc was showing his project to a developer to further convince him to spend millions and millions of dollars to create this, and him being in that one-to-one scale, he's like, oh, this is what it looks like, this is what it feels like, let's go with it, rather than blueprints and muddy renders. So I like the idea, like for architects as a representational tool to finally connect with the public and have them access our speculative projects and giving them a chance. And we don't have to. Architecture costs so much money, you know. So it's just so it's difficult for us. Only 0.001% get to actually build something, and when they do, only 30% of that design idea survives. But with VR, we could really shoot for the 100% and give our ideas a chance to potentially get built, but maybe it doesn't even matter. Maybe they don't need to get built anymore.
The problem with thinking about virtual reality simply as a representational device is that typically that level of representation doesn't happen until the end of a project. And so what we've experienced and what I've experienced in both my freelance work and my work at Roto Architects and Roto Lab is that allowing the designer access to that level of representation at the beginning of the project, rather than waiting for a very long and very expensive development process at the end of a design, at the end of a concept phase, just to show someone to say, I don't like it, right? You know, I kind of wish that you hadn't shown me this walkthrough. I would have built it otherwise. I've been told that before. It's a weird thing. To do all of that work just to convince someone not to build your project is weird. If you do that work from day one at every step of the design process all the way through, you as the designer, you catch those little mistakes before they happen, and you get to what we like to think of as designing from the inside out. So you're designing from the point of view of the character, and you're designing from the point of view of the activity and the program, and it's not so much about form, because form is often where we find those little mistakes that are caught later on in the representation process. If you design via program and program begets form, then you get a real world representation from the first step.
I mean, also, I think, hello? Yes. I think one of the questions about it is that what is it for and who is it for, right? I mean, is it is it a tool of the industry? Is it a creation tool, or is it a representation tool? Is it a feedback device? I think these are some of the questions that is going to be fundamental in the way in which some of these technologies are being integrated into the culture of design production. But I think there are a few risks involved in the way in which the current direction of how some of these tools are being interpreted. Like, for example, I don't consider VR as a kind of a three-dimensional Photoshop environment, or some kind of ability to be able to put yourself into Maya. Every time I showed a 3D model to a client, they always hate it. Like, they don't want to see it that way. They don't. It's almost like seeing like your parents without clothes or something like that. It feels like, you know, it is not the right way that this design should look. And they always want to stay away from that kind of level of abstraction, because that's not something that is for them, that is for the designer. So I think what we're going to see as the industry evolves is, again, like the same thing that we have seen in like, you know, any kind of digital design and modeling environments, is that there's going to be, I think, tools that are specialized for helping designers understand certain realities about their designs, which I would consider to be a kind of a heightened version of a 3D modeling environment. And then I think there will be tools that are more geared towards presenting that work to an outside audience, which is something a little bit more polished, but I think they're going to require different levels of resolution as these two kinds of ways of understanding and presenting work evolves. So in that regard, like, you know, some of these online digital platforms that I see kind of sprouting, which is like you upload your Rhino model or something, and then the client can click around, and I find these to be incredibly destructive to the reputation and also to the vision of a designer. I don't think that a client needs to have that level of access to your design. I think the client always needs to experience your design through a filter of the designer. And I think that is one of the fundamental, most powerful ways in which we present our work. And if there's one thing that we should, I think, stick with, it should be that.
I guess that makes me think of the application in filmmaking, which we've been thinking through a little bit, in terms of what kind of spaces, virtual spaces, can we create for the director, the cinematographer, and the production designer to get into together to plan the film? What kind of similar problems are we going to have? Where in that case, you know, we're obviously that team with the cinematographer specifically is figuring out how to frame the shots and stuff, but there's this wonderful use of tool or potential there for us to use it that way. And then when we were working on the VR script for the world building class, just thinking about a director trying to understand a VR experience which is locked out of time, and how do you navigate that and understand it. I think these are really interesting and pressing questions for us in terms of making tools that are useful for designers. Also, I think for installation artists and people working spatially with media, it's incredibly liberating to not think about having to have 15 projectors in order to make an immersive environment. And so there's a great design possibility there.
I feel like I kind of disagree, because to me, it seems like one of the possibilities of having virtual reality available on a mass scale is that you do cede a certain ground as a designer, but it empowers the person who's viewing, right? And I think that the way that can democratize the way that we experience space and architecture, and the way that we decide which spaces and architectures get built, could be really cool, right? And so I'm a little bit confused as to why you would take that position, like given that, you know, and I think the same thing for filmmaking. To me, it seems like in VR, you at least the way that I'm picturing it in my mind is that there wouldn't be a cinematographer, you would just be in the space, right? Go ahead.
Sorry, this is a really interesting conversation. But this is the whole problem for filmmakers sometimes moving into VR, is because you don't have control and you're giving up agency. And that's something you have to be happy to do. So that's why we're looking at the VR script and understanding that someone might take any path, and how do you understand the chaos of that and make sense of it in a meaningful way and give up some control and be okay with that. But we still have filmmaking where we can use it as a medium to control the image and still use VR. So in the case of architecture, you know, you may be making something stable eventually, but using it as a tool, prefiguring, same as film, and allowing yourself to maintain control of that vision. So that's how I see it.
Just to respond to your position, I think the point that I intend to make is that there's a notion of, I would say, democracy that exists in the digital world, which I think is kind of misguided, in the sense that when you are on Facebook or when you are on any kind of digital media platform, you do have the freedom to participate, but whatever your participation is also always being filtered by something. Something that has to do with a series of different parameters, whether that is Facebook's algorithm, or whether it's the number of people that you're friends with, or whether it's, you know, demographic that you're friends with and what have you. It's always a sort of a mediation there's always a kind of a mediated environment that gives you the illusion that this process is under your control. And in terms of building environments, I think the point of giving control to the user for me is about motion as opposed to the design itself. For example, if there are many patterns of motion that are defined in an environment that we design in a virtual space, then the user can have the ability to navigate through these multiple kinds of paths without me pushing them, let's say, into a building through a corridor or something like that, which is a very much curated kind of linear experience. Although obviously, realistically, a building has multiple different kinds of spaces and rooms. Like one of the traditional considerations of an architectural design is that the architect is obligated to visualize and predetermine these sequences and curate these experiences for the user. I think the moment of kind of democratizing that design comes into play when you have a digital environment where those choices are multiplied. They are kind of inflated to a point where a process that you have designed allows these kinds of spaces to be generated, as opposed to this kind of conclusive boundary of experience that you would propose. So what I'm talking about is that, I agree with you if you are seeing the designer or the architect as a kind of a conductor of these processes, and whether some of these design spaces are being generated by themselves or by some kind of other logic, or a logic that is being driven by the user or the behaviors of the user. I obviously agree with the fact that that experience allows the user to participate in the evolution of that design. But I don't think that it is realistic to, engage, let's say, an audience into a design process when that design process is still premature. Like, it would be like, let's say I'm shooting a movie and I am showing a really awful cut of the movie to a bunch of people after like 2 months into the process of shooting the movie, and then they're like, this is nonsense, I don't understand the sequence, I don't understand this and that. I think that is the risk of some of the emerging digital platforms, that they expose the design to an audience at a point where the design is premature. So that was my intention behind that.
I love that we've gotten into the discussion of agency and sovereignty within the question of virtual reality. If you ask a group of architects to turn over the control of their project to the client, what do you think they're going to say? If you ask a director to turn over the control of a project to the audience, what do you think they're going to say? What we're identifying here is the difference between a more traditional means of production and a more contemporary means of production. If you look at the development of virtual technology itself, there's no director. If you look at the Hyperledger project, which is a group venture between IBM and the Linux Foundation, they've got over 1 million people working towards the development of a blockchain that's cross-sector, right? And there is no boss. It's a decentralized democratic organization where chatbots regulate and where everyone's idea counts is weighted the same, right? So, and I think, and there are a number of architectural practices that are coming out that are looking at this new means of organization, this new means of addressing agency and sovereignty within the design process. There's a project called Foam that I'm just getting kind of acquainted with, and another one just popped up in my feed yesterday. But that's out there, and I think that while a number of people may think that that's a separate conversation than the one that we're having here, I think that virtual reality and augmented reality and mixed reality and these multiple blurry hybrid realities that we're soon going to be interacting with are really just interfaces for us to interact with a digital infrastructure that allows for us to have these types of organizations. I don't think limiting virtual reality as a means of saying, is it representation, is it not representation, is it for the client, is it for the user, is it for the designer, is it for the director, who's it for? I think that it is simply just a bridge into a much larger conversation about the organization of our digital content as we work horizontally towards the development of a project. And that's a conversation I would happily have with anyone for hours on end. So I'm going to stop talking now, and you can grab me afterwards if we want to keep going.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting that you bring that up, because I think that one thing that I've been thinking about lately a lot is when you're this vision of a future where we are all plugging into something that exists and interacting with it, you know, in this mixed media, mixed reality existence. How do you, as somebody who is a world builder or an architect or a designer setting up this society, how do you control for, or how do you acknowledge things like power dynamics or privilege, or, you know, the way that, like, how do you control for potential biases in the designer, or lapses in understanding, for example, like when you're creating something like this, you know, because it's our responsibility, right, as designers, to make sure that we're not subjugating people through the design or making people's lives like actively worse. How do you, as world designers or architects, control for those kinds of possibilities?
Yeah, so that's more interesting, like augmented reality and mixed reality for architecture. Virtual reality is like right now a representational tool, as we kind of talked about, or a design tool. But imagine we're looking at the ceiling and everyone has a different perspective of what they see. So we maybe as architects could design the infrastructure to or the facade tectonics, or some sort of system embedded in the physicality that works with our like if we have integrated biotech or some sort of glasses or some sort of phone that's positioned towards that physical object or surface, but I'm seeing an advertisement, you're seeing something else, he's seeing something else. So I think we're going to, the infrastructure embedded, or these kind of smart objects are going to react to individuals differently. So, and I don't know if that's machine learning that's going to manipulate that, but maybe that's what I meant by the users might be the new architects, that it's not really about, maybe not the object is maybe the background, but the foreground is the infrastructure and some sort of digital system that works with individuals on a very personal level. I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, what I find interesting about the question and also this conversation so far is that it is, you know, even though we're talking about virtual reality, we're actually in fact talking about an entire ecosystem of technologies that establish relationships between the digital and the physical worlds, whether that is the Internet of Things or embedded sensors or robotics, and, you know, ranging from industrial robotics to other applications, human-robot collaboration, whatever kinds of emerging technologies or new forms of production realities and experiential realities that we're going to have to face, I think bring up obviously a huge baggage of new forms of ethics and how we're going to handle those questions that relate to those ethics. But I mean, I think in order to keep the scope of the conversation manageable, I think one thing that we can say is that the access to design is going to be, let's say, democratized in the sense that you would be able to spread experiences, spatial experiences, much more quickly and efficiently and more democratically. Like, for example, if somebody cannot afford to go travel to Bilbao and see the Guggenheim, you can simulate that kind of environment and that kind of experience to that person. Or if a young architect cannot build a Guggenheim, maybe he or she can build 20,000 different digital Guggenheims and be able to create a kind of a pipeline of production for their own work in that way. And I don't consider this to be a kind of a problem, in the sense that I absolutely have no problems with the idea of experiencing things digitally only. And I don't consider that to be a kind of an ethical issue within the world of creative production. If you're talking about food and things like that, obviously, we're material beings and we exist in this world, and access to physical resources and health and whatever you consider to be about quality of life is one dimension, but the more intellectual experience is being expanded radically with this kind of a sensory interface proposition, because at the end of the day, the VR headset is a form of sensory interface, and that interface can be expanded and contracted. It could happen completely digitally. It could happen in a mixed reality, but that mixed reality could be visual. It could be physical in the sense that I'm moving my arm here, and then a robotic arm is somewhere else moving. These are all kinds of issues that relate to cyber-physical systems that should be probably thought about as a kind of as an ecosystem, as a kind of an accumulation of the different technologies and how they interact with each other, I would say.
I was drawn to thinking of the person with no means sort of making their own piece, and just the power of giving space to ideas that physically can't manifest. So I think there's a lot of potential in the agency there.
Also sustainable.
Yeah, totally sustainable. Talk about Ready Player One. We'll get in there and have a bunch of beautiful designs. And I've lost my second point, so maybe I can follow Nels. Oh, I remembered. The other thing that I haven't gotten into very specifically, but world building process is highly collaborative. That's the reason that I'm so obsessed with it, probably, because I'm in the socializing idealist quadrant of that gamer square. So I really like people to get together and contribute, and that's the entire process. So we're interviewing people, play testing with them, really being very intentional about making sure that people have the say in the design, and that's just supposed to always be part of the process. So, of course, ideology will never go away. So.
Oh yeah, one thing that I wanted to talk about is in terms of the idea of virtual reality. I feel like when I'm constantly on my phone and reading and looking at things, I will think back and sort of feel like I've blacked out for a certain amount of time, and I wonder how, with virtual reality and augmented reality, what role does like the creation of memory play? Like, do you remember, like, when you're in VR, what it's like to be in there, or for the user, like, is that something that's embedded in the thing that you're trying to design if the end product is virtual?
Okay, so when we're talking about the creation of memory, are we talking about the creation of memories, or are we talking about the generation of brain cells? Because we can have both of those conversations if you'd want. So, and you can probably jump in here as well. We at RotoLab have been looking at a number of studies that study the growth of cells within the hippocampal region in the brain while playing video games, right? And what we're actually finding is that in traditional video games, not we, what the people that we're studying are finding, and I can get you those sources later. I don't have them on the top of my head right now. But what we're finding is that the people that play traditional games on two-dimensional screens tend to respond more to the habit response. I'm going to try and catch my business partner's eye to make sure that I'm, yes? Or just raise your hand if I'm wrong, okay? And so people that play games on a two-dimensional screen tend to respond more to a habit response, right? They aren't generating any new brain cells. They're responding to an activity that they've already performed. What we're finding out is that people in virtual reality, because they have more of a sensory input, tend to generate more brain cells, in that sense memory, than they would if they were just looking on a two-dimensional screen. 1 second.
Hi. So just one just edit of that. So depending upon the study, the earliest studies looking at gamers was on visual spatial acuity. And there you get to see change in neural real estate. But when the 3D version comes in, when you bring in virtual reality, it's a different kind of study. Then you get to see another kind of learning that's coming because you have more sensory input. And that immersion that Guvenc was speaking of is actually the question that neuroscientists are very interested in because it allows them to look at all the senses working piece by piece, network to network, right? And in collaboration.
Dr. Greenstein, everyone.
Me, I feel like it's, again, an issue of resolution of that particular technological interface. When I think about the kind of, for example, the question of the screen door effect, right? Because it's you put the headset on, it doesn't matter how much time you spent on the lighting or the content creation or whatever you want to call it, it looks pixelated, and it constantly reminds you that you are not in an environment that you are used to seeing and being convinced by. And that is clearly an interruption. And there's also, the problem of not being able to keep it more than, personally, if I'm on it more than 20 minutes, I have to take it off. And there's something off about the way that your eye's optics and your perception interferes with the way that the primitive nature of that technology is devised. So there's always a moment where you're not fully immersed. I would say the moments of being fully immersed in that environment usually relate to gestures, or usually relate to some kind of physical activity that has a certain kind of consequence in that environment, as opposed to just viewing that environment. Because viewing only provides certain kind of visual cues about the way in which you interact with that environment. But I think there is a certain reality or kind of an immersiveness that happens when you are engaged in a certain kind of activity. And that's why I think, going back to the point that I made in my mini talk, the idea of experience as a kind of a new artistic medium is very interesting, in the sense that it's going to require a certain kind of artistic or intellectual prowess to be able to come up with tools or experiences to create a convincing and immersive form of reality in the virtual world.
I think there are also a lot of interesting things to be learned from just the general neuroscience of memory. Other things that fascinate me on this topic include context-dependent memory. And so like I'm in this space and I learn something from my fellow panelists and I come in here later and remember that thing. So just thinking about how we can design for those potentials, and if you start just following the neuroscience trails of how memory works and the idiosyncrasies of it all, there are so many beautiful ideas of what we could design in VR and AR. I think maybe specifically AR in order to augment memory.
For our project, for Room XYZ, it's being in VR for people right now. It's like going to Venice for the first time. You focus on a very particular thing and you focus on that, so you remember that. So it's a brand new environment. So we set up an open-ended narrative where everyone focused and remembered a very particular part in the experience, and then collectively share those experiences, and then collectively completed the story, consolidated the story. So I think it's very personal. Like VR is it's such a brand new atmosphere that everyone has a very particular focus on what really captures their attention, and then they kind of remember that. But then, what I'm really interested, the film I'm working on for the next year is focused on integrated biotech, where these headsets are somewhat integrated with your let's say your brain. So whatever I'm thinking is sort of happening rather than clicking buttons, rather than a gaming strategy. It's sort of just integrated in the way you think. So I'm really curious when we do, or if we do, have IBT or integrated biotech, how that's gonna really mess with your memory, or is, you know, are you gonna be able to save memories and then activate them when you want to activate them, or I'm speculating on what that might be.